From ARUP Laboratories on the campus of the University of Utah, welcome to the LabMind podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Jackson. Today is Wednesday, the 14th of July, 2021. I'm excited to have as our guest on LabMind today, Dr. Karen Heichman. Karen's at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where she is Deputy Director for Diagnostics within the Global Health Division. Our conversation today will include some discussion about the role of diagnostic testing within global health and sort of this interplay between technology development, global health, and potentially even how technologies developed for low-resource settings can come back to benefit other countries as well. Dr. Heichman received her PhD in biological chemistry from UCLA, followed by a postdoc at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle, Washington. She went on to work for Myriad Genetics, then later the Huntsman Cancer Institute here at the University of Utah. And then I met her when she was here at ARUP Laboratories as Vice President of Technology Development, and also directed the PharmaDX program, which included developing new diagnostic tests for the pharmaceutical industry. Karen has been with the Gates Foundation since 2018. Karen Heichman, welcome to LabMind.
Great. Thanks, Brian. It's nice to see you again and nice to hear your voice.
And likewise. So some of our listeners may or may not have a complete picture of what the term global health really means. For example, I think some people, when they hear global health, think about disaster relief because that's what makes the news often. Organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, and doing war zone medicine and that kind of thing. But global health is much larger than that. So when I say global health, how do you sort of frame that in your head?
So when we think about global health at the Gates Foundation and in the global community, we think largely about infectious diseases that primarily impact low and middle income countries. And these diseases include malaria, tuberculosis. HIV obviously has a dual role in both developed and underdeveloped countries, as well as other types of rare diseases like the so-called neglected tropical diseases, also the enteric and diarrheal diseases, and some of the diseases that we don't even think about in the developed world very much anymore, like polio. So these are really unmet needs that are addressed more at the level of the global community and tie in very closely to the work that is performed by the World Health Organization and other global funders of health sort of at a worldwide level. It includes things like diagnostic development, vaccine development, therapeutic development, but also includes the infrastructure for procurement, implementation studies, clinical research at a global level, as well as infrastructure for pandemic preparedness and surveillance.
So when a lot of people think about global health, they immediately think of Africa and the Live Aid concert and that kind of stuff. But when you think global health, what locations around the world are you thinking about?
Primarily, we focus on underserved populations throughout the world. At a financial level, we focus on low and middle income countries that have very low per person allocation of funds for healthcare, for medicines, for vaccines, diagnostics, and other medical types of services. We also focus on underserved populations, even within higher income countries that don't receive access to those services. And I think in the United States, even the COVID-19 pandemic illustrated the vast disparity between the healthcare services that are afforded to people with insurance and are otherwise connected to the healthcare system versus people that are institutionalized or come from populations that are lower resourced.
So when you talk about therapeutics, drugs in particular, as well as vaccines, I think that those are easy to understand how that fits into solving infectious disease problems around the world. Talk a little bit about where diagnostics fits into this. I'm not sure it's quite as intuitive. What do you see as some of the big diagnostic needs in lower resource countries?
One of the big problems is that there is a vast reservoir of people in low and middle income countries that actually have diseases that are potentially curable, but they go largely undiagnosed because they do not have access to diagnostic services. So for instance, tuberculosis has sometimes estimated 2 to 3 million individuals per year that develop TB and are never diagnosed when it's a fully curable disease using an antibiotic cocktail. And so the fact that there are few diagnostic tests to uncover these infected individuals is a severe limitation. And it also provides for a reservoir for transmission. If there are 2 to 3 million people out there within their families and communities and workplaces and living situations that have undiagnosed illness, there's really rapid spread amongst communities and individuals and very high burden and impact. One of the challenges around diagnostics is that a Ministry of Health for a particular country has a budget for healthcare. There's often no recognition of the value of diagnostics here, where if you have a single pot of money, you might only want to spend it on therapeutic treatment or things like oxygen or hospital beds or vaccine campaigns, and really not having a recognition of the value of diagnostics to target those therapies and services to specific individuals and also to limit the spread of disease.
Do you think that plays out at the provider level as well? I'm thinking here in the US, you go to the doctor, you've got, whatever symptoms. There will often be just a reflex set of lab tests and other types of diagnostic tests that'll get ordered right from the outset without even having to think about it, because that's just the way medicine is practiced in high resource settings like here. If you're a doctor in a lower income country and you're used to treating based on symptoms, is it challenging to insert a diagnostic test in there and develop the trust level and sort of the practice pattern, if you will? I don't know. Is this a problem that gets brought up?
Absolutely. I think one really good example would be in malaria. If a person presents to a clinic or facility with a fever, and especially a parent has a child and the child has a high fever, the healthcare provider really wants to provide some kind of therapeutic option to that parent and to that child. Now, the challenge is that in some of these settings, the most common diagnosis might be malaria, okay? And that might be the first diagnostic inquiry that's made. And there are existing low-cost rapid diagnostic tests for malaria that could be used to test the patient. The problem is that if the patient does not have malaria, the healthcare worker may not have any other therapeutic option to treat that patient. And what they might end up doing, because they want to provide some kind of treatment, they want the parent to feel like they're able to treat their child, they might actually disregard a negative test result in order to treat the child anyway, because they have no other options for treatment. And so that represents a really distinct challenge around how diagnostics are used and valued. And one of the things that we think might really address that kind of challenge is having some kind of digital guidance and connectivity that could be used to complement a diagnostic test with direction and a way to provide for an avenue for further diagnostic workup, other types of services that you could connect that parent and that child. And so not only to keep the healthcare worker honest and make sure that they're appropriately reading the result, but also to educate and provide an avenue to additional services that would basically give some kind of structure around the treatment of that patient and care by the parent. And so that's one way that we think about tools that would be used to bring that person into a healthcare system, even when they're in the community and in a low resource setting.
Yeah, I remember years ago reading some articles on pneumonia deaths in high malaria settings, so say sub-Saharan Africa. And a lot of kids would die of bacterial pneumonia. So not malaria, but bacterial pneumonia, because the symptoms may be indistinguishable from malaria. I always thought of that as being, well, they're not bothering to test, but you're pointing out that maybe they're testing for malaria, but knowing that the test isn't 100% accurate, and so just giving them antimalarials when they really need antibacterials.
Yes, absolutely. And that's one of the things that is a challenge, which is a healthcare worker wants to be in a situation where they cause some good, that they can help the person that's seeking care. And they may only have a limited set of resources and products that they can use for treatment. And I think one question that sort of underpins this hypothetical situation that you posed to me, Brian, is that it may go even further and deeper in that there's an underlying medical condition that's never diagnosed because of social stigma and lack of targeted therapy. And one that comes to mind in that setting might be sickle cell disease. So sickle cell disease is thought to be a major killer of children under the age of 5 in certain endemic populations. But the testing is not widely available or even desired because there's social stigma around it, and there isn't necessarily the infrastructure for prophylactic treatment of those patients that have sickle cell disease. And certainly the family planning aspect makes it a very complicated situation around education and around the social consequences of that. And so it's actually diagnostics play a really interesting role in the setting of when a diagnosis doesn't necessarily bring a complementary treatment or pathway for the patient or the family. And so it's very complicated. I think one of the other challenges around diagnostics, though, in these settings is that we think about ARUP and the large reference labs, even regional labs in the United States, and they're staffed with and have the instruments and the consumables to do very complicated tests, which without a markup and even without, a commercial use case are expensive, I think, by global health standards. Certainly only a fraction of a whole treatment care for an individual patient. But in global health, we're typically talking about tests that would cost on the order of single-digit dollars. So if you think about all the tests that you can run at a reference lab, for that price tag, you're not talking about many. So what that means is we're talking about an alternative type of suite of services where in some cases we're talking about simple rapid diagnostic tests that can be performed even in the absence of an instrument, such as lateral flow assay, which is the prototype assay for a pregnancy test, where a specimen is applied directly to a test strip, and then a result is given out visually. No instrument is required. And really, a very untrained individual could perform the test, and a very easy to collect specimen would be used. Those are the types of strategies that we think about that could be manufactured at a small number of dollars. Also thinking about other point of care types of tests. And one of the issues in global health that's a challenge is that there's often a huge disconnect between the time that a specimen is collected and the time that a test is performed, and an even bigger disconnect as far as the return of the result to the healthcare worker and finally to the individual. Believe it or not, many of the test results are never received back at the point where the specimen is collected. B, the result is returned in paper format and goes into a box full of paper results that is never associated with an individual. And oftentimes the patient is lost to follow-up. So in the absence of system for electronic healthcare records, unique identifiers for an individual, most people have access to mobile phones, so that is a way to get to them. But you often have people that are migrant workers. They don't live in the place where they work. So many of these people are lost to follow-up. The desire for rapid diagnostic tests where the result is returned to the individual at the point of care during that care encounter is really of premium importance. When we think about the technologies that we focus on developing for global health, we're talking about rapid return of result, low complexity tests, but high performance and high quality. We don't want to compromise on that, but we're talking about lower cost instrumentation or no instrumentation at all, and lower cost consumables. It really poses unique challenges that I don't think we think about at all when we think about the developed world, but we're talking about an entirely alternative set of types of tests. Now, COVID-19 has really illustrated, I think, in the high-income countries, that there may be value in testing that can be performed either in the home or in the workplace or at a pharmacy. The question of, can we take the learnings of global health and actually apply it back to high-income countries? I think we can, and COVID-19 has actually showed us one potential alternative and complementary type of technology that could be useful in a dual market setting.
Just to complete the COVID discussion a little bit. Don't you think if there were more specific antivirals available, that those rapid COVID tests might have had a stronger use case? They really haven't made a huge impact in the US, but I think maybe that has more to do with sort of the nature of the follow-up as opposed to sort of the fundamental theoretic value of diagnostics.
Absolutely. When we think about COVID testing, in the end, it ends up being more about public health and trying to limit transmission versus the way that you treat an individual, right? So most of the time, an individual stays home, stays away from people, and gets better. In a small number of cases, an individual who's at high risk or has very high burden disease might be put on a targeted therapy like a monoclonal antibody therapy or potentially small molecule therapy, or might actually be admitted into the hospital. But that's the edge case, really, in the case of COVID. Now, when we think to what is the next step here, I think the gap is small between a rapid diagnostic test, say for influenza, and the connection to a prescription for Tamiflu. In the event that a person during flu season who's had an exposure, who's at high risk, like an elderly person in a nursing home or a long-term care facility, the person is exposed to flu and has a rapid diagnostic test that tests positive, then that person can rapidly get a Tamiflu prescription and get on therapy in that time window where it can have an impact on the outcome. I think another strategy also would be around testing for RSV, especially in nursing homes and in pediatric hospitals, those kinds of settings where treatment of the individual might be important, or isolation or other public health measures that would help to better protect people within the household or the care facility or other work or living environments. So those are good examples of that, where it's sort of a test and treat approach. And I think the idea of in-home, in-workplace testing that would directly link to a therapeutic outcome and a treatment path makes a lot of sense, if nothing more, to bring the person into a care facility for further treatment and evaluation. Immunoassays in general, and I think lateral flow tests specifically, don't have the same kind of sensitivity or specificity that you might see with a molecular test. And a molecular test, I think most people would view as the gold standard for some types of detection, and certainly are better for quantitative analysis. Now, certainly, I think when we think about the future for global health, we would love to be able to bring molecular testing much closer to the point of care, for all the reasons that we talked about, for having more sensitivity and more specificity, and the ability to have quantification, the ability to detect sometimes sequence variants and changes, the ability to be able to discern drug susceptibility and drug resistance at the point of care. And so I would say that when we talk about the work that we do on our team, which is called the Innovative Technology Solutions team, we're looking for new and novel technologies that can meet some of those goals and address some of those gaps at the point of care. And so point of care molecular is definitely a focus that we have here. So what are the technologies that would lend themselves to low cost and rapid molecular testing that has those performance characteristics of sensitivity and specificity? Developments around new devices that are simple and easy to use and don't require a trained operator, collection devices that can allow for a specimen to be self-collected or collected by an untrained individual, where a PCR or other type of molecular test may be performed on a crude lysate or a sample that has not undergone a lot of purification. Those are strategies that we're taking. And a third piece to this is around a digital component. And part of that is because what you're asking for is a low resource setting with a not very highly skilled operator to perform a pretty complicated test. And so there needs to be guidance for specimen collection. There needs to be guidance for quality control. There needs to be guidance that the method is operated appropriately and that the results interpretation are correct. And so one of the focuses that we have in global health is using mobile phone technology to bring some of those pieces to the point of care, to guide the use of diagnostics, the interpretation of the results, connect the patient to the next step in the care setting. So for treatment or reflex confirmatory testing, and to bring that person into a higher level setting if they require medical treatment that requires a more skilled individual, a proper medical doctor, or interaction with the public health authorities for disease reporting. I think the piece that really brings molecular and more complicated tests to the point of care will ultimately rely on that digital connectivity piece. And that's a piece that is really being developed now for use with your rapid diagnostic tests, your immunoassays. So that leap is not a big leap right now. But I think the instrumentation and the low cost materials are the limitation for point of care molecular.
It seems to me that a lot of the kinds of things you've been talking about, miniaturization, moving to platforms that don't require a central laboratory, all of the kinds of technologies that support decentralized testing in the field, close to the patient, or even in many cases by the patient. It seems to me that that's an area that's been underinvested in historically. And I wonder if it's just because we're so used to having this sort of high-tech hospital-based infrastructure in places like the United States. Even looking at glucometers, for example, that's the example of handheld point-of-care diagnostics everyone's familiar with. I don't know the numbers, but I'm betting that the cost of running a glucose on a test strip on a glucometer may actually be even higher than running a glucose off of a serum sample in the hospital on a high volume instrument. Plus the point of care one is slightly less accurate. So the cost is arguing against it, the accuracy is arguing against it, and yet everyone knows that glucometers are this enormously valuable tool because they're allowing testing to take place that otherwise just wouldn't take place. I mean, patients aren't going to come into the hospital 3 times a day to check their glucose. Do you feel like point of care and decentralizable diagnostics have been underinvested in historically? And maybe this is where global health can provide a nice jump start to these kinds of things that can come back and benefit everyone else?
Absolutely. I think that as I spent my time at EREP and also had, peripheral awareness of it at Myriad Genetics and also at the Huntsman Cancer Institute, laboratory testing was largely the practice of pathology and the practice of medicine. And there was a strong involvement of medical directors in patient care guided by testing. And in my view, there's a complementary role for testing that can originate outside of the healthcare system. So either with a self-collected specimen, with testing at the point of care where a person lives or works, and that there are really synergistic roles here and avenues for patient care. Access is one piece that I think is super important. Certainly, as you said, Brian, you don't want to have a person have to come into a clinic and have a phlebotomy and have a test run, even if it's much less expensive, because we all know that it's like the old parable about the least expensive thing about buying a horse is buying a horse. The problem is that bringing a person into a care setting, having them registered in the system and a phlebotomist and all the tracking and billing insurance and all the things that you do, that's a very expensive process, even if you gave away the glucose test for free, right? So I think if you take out all of that, you provide more access. Having people be able to collect specimens and run them or have them passively run through devices at home really increases compliance, right? And it allows you to bring testing to people that don't have the access to come into the care system, don't have the time during the day. In the case of global health, we're talking about people that might have to walk 20 miles to get to a clinic. And it's unreasonable to think that people would do that more than 1 or 2 times a year. And certainly in the setting of a person who is sick, expecting that they're going to come in for testing when somebody could very well go out to them and collect a specimen and send it to the lab, or could perform testing where they live or where they work, just makes a lot more sense. In the developed world, I think COVID has really broken down a lot of the barriers here, where I've talked to clinical infectious disease experts at major academic centers who confess that she takes her children and herself to the local COVID clinic to get testing when they go on vacation or go to summer camp or what have you, rather than have her children have a nasopharyngeal swab and tested in her own clinical lab. I think we can all appreciate that the convenience around this is important. And I think as costs come down, it will enable more kinds of testing, like testing for back to work settings, testing in the case of healthcare workers who are expected to come to work even when they have a risk of exposure. I think if people could do that at home before they come to work, and this could be connected to their human resources or to their employee healthcare clinics or what have you, it really keeps us in a situation where it's easier for the individual, it's more protective for the individual as well as their coworkers and the patients that they interact with. I think that those models and use cases are bearing out now in the United States and are kind of showing the way. These are things we worked on at the foundation and in global health in general well before COVID. And I think COVID infused awareness around diagnostics in general, awareness around the issues of self-collection and self-testing and the benefits that those could have, and has brought an infusion of a tremendous amount of capital to the development of novel technologies that could be used near and at the point of care. I think the RADx program supported by the NIH has gone a long ways towards technology development in the point of care space and certainly around point of care molecular. The work around collection devices and stability has been an area that I've focused on. I think that that's led the way to home collection kits. And I know that some of the major reference labs use those for COVID testing. And I think that that will bleed out into other disease areas like your flus and your RSVs and even sexually transmitted infections, where certainly women can collect their own specimens in the privacy of their own homes and send those in for testing, where they don't need to take time off of work, where they don't need to share with people that they're going in for testing, and could really connect them to very private prescriptions and treatment and care plans that are really outside of coming in. And I think telemedicine shows us that people really want that, and it is much more efficient and much less costly if people don't actually have to come to facilities.
So it sounds like a message for anyone listening to this podcast who's engaged in new diagnostic technology development. Focus on access, focus on convenience, focus on speed, all of which are related to decentralizing and getting it out of the central laboratory to the patient, and not just having a tunnel vision around accuracy and per test cost. Not that those aren't important, but they're not the only factors.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'd like to pivot a little bit onto another topic that I think is close to your day-to-day work, but let me ease into this with a question about what is your job like at the Gates Foundation? If I looked at your calendar over the course of a couple weeks, what kinds of appointments would you have? Where are they? Who are you talking with? Not specifics, obviously, but what is your work like?
Prior to coming to the foundation, I did not have a good idea of what my work day would be like and who would be the people that I would talk to. So on the one hand, I am involved in new technology development and also supporting product development efforts for diagnostics for TB and HIV. And that's sort of my day-to-day roles, where I manage a large number of investments, which largely take the form of grants, but sometimes can be contracts, where I have grantees that could be companies, IVD manufacturers, could be small startup biotechs, could be academics who conduct novel research and development, who develop products, and who take those through regulatory processes. And that's sort of my bread and butter. The other things that I do are that I have a group of grantees that are distributed in Africa who represent different language speaking areas. So I have grantees under this laboratory innovation grant who are laboratory professionals that can evaluate and develop novel diagnostics and laboratory systems. So I work with the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa and the National Health Laboratory Services. This is a team who are laboratory professionals. They conduct 6 million or more HIV viral load tests per year, and they are the best of the best as far as laboratorians. They're English speaking. I work with a team in contrast in Mozambique, and they are basically right under the Minister of Health, and the PI is basically the head of the NIH in Mozambique. And they're extremely low resource setting. They conduct excellent laboratory tests and test evaluations, but they have very low resources, and they are charged with traveling all over the country to bring services to very low income settings. I also work with a team in Senegal, and they are an institute for kind of laboratory innovation and diagnostics, and they serve as a center around Western Africa in the French-speaking countries. As we develop new diagnostics through our grantees and our partners, I have test beds for clinical feasibility studies in place. And these are laboratorians that understand both point of care, but also central laboratory. And I can take those products and bring those groups together and fund research studies. I work very closely with the US FDA, especially during COVID. We have strong connections with CDRH, and we have informal conversations amongst ourselves about new products and strategies for regulatory science, but also work to kind of shepherd in our grantees to have informal dialogues with the FDA as things are emerging. And certainly during COVID, we had a number of late night weekend meetings with the FDA to bring forward the work that we were funding for nasal swabs for COVID, for instance. And we have an ongoing dialogue. I work very closely with the WHO, in particular the TB team, as well as with the pre-qualification team that does the regulatory authorizations. I typically, during peacetime, meaning before COVID, travel to our grantee sites that are really throughout the world. I get to Geneva frequently during normal times to meet with people at the WHO, and as well as FIND, which is the Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics, and they really work closely with the global health regulators. So I work with those people in global health, but then also working with different key opinion leaders in the US and the rest of the world to understand what are the new technologies, what are the trends, where's the unmet need. And finally, work with funding agencies. So the Gates Foundation funds many of these global health initiatives, but part of the work we do is also to work with other funding agencies, either that come from countries, the USAID and UNITAID. We work with the funding agencies and philanthropies through other sovereign nations, as well as independent philanthropic bodies that are for individuals like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or also collective philanthropies that fund specific things. We also work with, Africa's CDC and other groups. So really work with all different kinds of people. And it's about managing a portfolio of work and investments, but also socializing those programs, thinking about strategies for implementation, and also working closely with manufacturers, wanting to have carved out and dedicated manufacturing capacity specifically for global health, so that in the setting of unique tests or needs for global health, or a blended market where the inclination would be for the large manufacturers to sell out everything they could make to high income countries, making sure that we can preserve capacity for low and middle income countries and other underserved populations. A lot of it is around generation of contracts. We have global access agreements with our suppliers and manufacturers. And sometimes it's actually funding, standing up manufacturing capacity specific for those protected populations that we serve.
You're describing a really complex landscape of lots of different types of organizations and grantees. It sounds very, very different from, say, classic NIH-funded basic science research, which is much more focused on individual academic labs. But you're talking about connecting up lots of different types of organizations.
Yeah, so really we have specific strategies that we execute on. So, for instance, in my portfolio for TB, I'm looking at the development of point of care tests for a non-invasive specimen for TB testing near the point of care. Now, certainly your Abbotts have products that they've developed, and some of the other manufacturers that you know a lot about have products, but they don't necessarily meet the needs and the intended uses for the markets that we're hoping to serve. And so what we do is we fund different groups that develop aspects of those technologies for specimen preparation, specimen collection, signal amplification, return of results. And it isn't necessarily one singular group. So I might place a strategic investment or a grant with a small biotech company that does a good job at concentrating the analyte from a large volume of urine, for instance, and then work with another group that has a technology to amplify signals, or another group that has a digital solution for transmitting the result to public health authorities. And I bring them together. I fund them each separately and for specific goals and milestones. And then I bring them together into collaboration and consortia to develop singular products that then can be used for global health purposes. It's often, using the metaphor, herding cats, bringing in lots of different individuals that can contribute to that collective goal. And full disclosure, a lot of the work is around cajoling and encouraging and enthusing groups to work together. Certainly funding the work gives me some degree of leverage, and certainly being part of an effort from the Gates Foundation is motivation for some, but it really takes driving things all the way through. So interacting with the regulators and the funders and the manufacturers at all the levels, and in some cases applying funds for that, and in other cases just forging alliances and collaborations.
You used the word socializing early on. It seems to go along with the cajoling and the bringing together.
Yeah, global health moves at usually a pretty slow pace. So when you talk about socializing, you talk about getting World Health Organization, getting ministers of health, getting countries that have dedicated budgets for healthcare. When you talk about encouraging other funders to contribute to efforts, while the foundation puts in a lot of money here, we really do try to get participation by other stakeholders, by the sovereign nations, by countries like Japan and Korea that have their own granting programs to stimulate development in global health. And we can, match funds. I evaluate proposals. Typically, the way that we do grants, though, is not traditional like you would see with NIH, where there would be like a request for proposals. There's a specific theme where people submit an application. It's much more directed. So reaching out to individuals and opinion leaders and excellent groups and having a dialogue, going through sort of a concept note of what we would like to see done, and then working iteratively on a grant application and a proposal and a budget. And then it's minimally quarterly meetings to talk through progress. But, given COVID and the speed that things have been moving at, usually we're talking about at least weekly meetings. So at one point I had, I think, 70 different grants and investments, and I would have very frequent meetings and updates and review progress and milestones. Sometimes it's brainstorming and reviewing data. That's the best part of my job. But oftentimes it's making sure that everybody's on track and that they're talking to the other stakeholders to make sure that they're getting to the goals that we're hoping to achieve.
This all sounds really fascinating. The types of organizations that you're talking about, government agencies, large for-profit companies, academic departments, just those three examples have very different cultures, very different ways of getting things done, huge intellectual assets. So lots of opportunity, but to actually get them to work together, I'm impressed and amazed to hear your description of how you've done this. I hope in the future there are more examples of either funding agencies or other sort of umbrella groups like the Gates Foundation that develop more skills in bringing these disparate types of organizations all to the table to work together.
I think that that's one of the biggest challenges to the work that we do, is working with all kinds of stakeholders. If you had any idea how much time that I spent on the material science aspect of nasal swab collection for COVID and standing up our grantees in Florida to, individually package and sterilize nasal swabs, right? I never thought that this was something that I would be doing, talking to CEOs of companies that make collection devices, or giving a presentation to the African Society of Laboratory Medicine, or talking to WHO or the CEOs of major IVD companies. I think that the Gates Foundation affords a certain kind of access that you don't necessarily have in other environments. And that is really a benefit, I think, by getting the attention. Certainly by sending outreach emails and phone calls, you tend to get replies easier than you would in other settings. I think that just having a big checkbook doesn't take you all the way there. You really need to get people to understand the value and how important the work is, and how, more than anything, we're representing people that don't necessarily have the voice. One of the mission statements, or one of the kind of parables that comes through the Gates Foundation, is all lives have equal value. I think the idea that the work that we do is to bring together things for populations of people that can't do it for themselves. But I think the work is so rewarding in that way that it's not hard to convince people with a heart and a soul to get involved. Even big companies and even countries and governments, I think when you appeal to the very human aspects of this and the potential for impact, it's not that hard to motivate people. I would say that when I start any of these big programs, really going to the very highest level and talking about the burden and the impact and how we can make a difference, and how sometimes incremental things can make a really big impact. And in other cases, it might be something really, really hard that's going to take years of work and diligence and money. But I think letting people understand the role that they play in the equation and how important it is, a really strong strategy that's worked well to date.
Well, Karen Heichman, thank you so much for being on LabMind today. We've covered a ton of material, and I think a lot of really important topics, not just for global health, but for healthcare, period. So thank you so much for being on today.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
LabMind is sponsored by ARUP Laboratories, a not-for-profit enterprise of the University of Utah and its Department of Pathology. Our producer is Cherie Peterson, with audio engineering by Claudia Escobar. You can find other LabMind episodes at arup.utah.edu, along with an extensive video lecture library providing free CME and CE credits for medical and laboratory professionals. You can also subscribe to LabMind on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or your other favorite podcast app. If you do access it on an app, I would encourage you to leave a rating and review in order to help others find the podcast.